Welcome, glad you stopped by. Today should hopefully be a real treat, especially for the many of you who had commented your requests and concerns on the previous RTS main timeline. Well, I'm also here to tell you that this video will not cover every RTS there is, because that would be impossible. But our overall goal, you, yes you, and I, is to cover as many timelines of video game genre as we possibly can. And because the RTS meant a lot to me and a good chunk of you out there, we'll begin an alternate timeline of the RTS we will call the Hidden Gems. These hidden gems within the RTS genre oftentimes get overlooked, underappreciated, and simply have not had the marketing exposure as vast games we covered on the main RTS timeline. We also have to ensure that we are not misinterpreting these games as unsuccessful RTS. They have chipped in their fair share to the RTS development, and sometimes, surprisingly enough, accomplish it before the main RTS. Of the first of these hidden gems, we will go back to the Sega Genesis days in 1989 and 1990 in North America, where one of the early titles released for the console called Herzogs Way was presented to the gaming world. But as we learn on the main RTS timeline, this game was not marketed as an RTS, as the name of the video game genre only circulated once Dune 2 was released a few years later. On this note, the RTS main principles found in Dune 2 will not all be visible in this game, though we will at least see a few of them. Resource gathering is presented in a different manner to what the usual RTS presented during the 90s aside from Total Annihilation and a few other RTS. The resource was money and it was collected at a constant rate once a base was captured by the infantry units you dispatch. Unit recruitment is also mandatory in order to beat the opponent, which was either AI controlled or another human player. The infantry are the sole units to be able to capture the bases. Other units are the supply truck, who supplies gas to all moving units such as the fast-moving, weak motorcycle, the medium-damaging armored car, the heavier damaging units such as the SAM and tanks, and lastly the ultimate base defense and most expensive unit, the cannon. One unique feature in this game that does not seem to come directly from the RTS, but a genre that has branched off from it, called MOBA. You can control a main unit who can fly, attack, and pick up dispatched units and drop them anywhere on the map. You have no control over the recruited units, but you are able to purchase one of many orders for them to engage in. Examples being patrolling, secure base, main base attack, stationary, and more. These orders are able to be changed after dispatch, but at the cost of money again, which adds to the already plentiful setbacks. The fueling of all units is probably the most dreadful, having to recruit supply units to fuel units while they rely on fuel themselves. Despite all this, when playing Herzogs Way, there's a lot happening that will keep you busy with all the micromanagement of the one important mech that you control, on top of the macro which comes from the money produced from occupying small outposts. This RTS seems frustrating and time-consuming now with all the repetitive tasks, but it was something new to gamers then who are not used to this top-down shooter RTS style hybrid at the time. Now moving on to another RTS hybrid series published and developed by Ubisoft Blue Byte, who are now fully owned by widely known developer-publisher Ubisoft. The Settlers, we'll be covering both 1 and 2, is claimed to be an RTS with city building simulation and features, but I think it's more of a city builder with minor RTS features. But we will clarify that shortly. The German-developed game was initially released for the Amiga, and later ported for MS-DOS the following year. So nothing really unordinary that past city builders haven't already covered. Pick a space on the map to build your HQ, the castle, where all other buildings that have a certain task will surround it and expand across the map. It is preferred to build your castle near terrains that have at least one or more of the following: water, trees, stone, and mountain ranges. This will be important for the many role-playing buildings mentioned before that will require one of these terrains in order to produce for your economy. By placing a lumberjack near trees, you are able to chop trees and produce lumber. Keep in mind that trees are finite, so adding a building called the forest house near a lumberjack will ensure that new trees are planted. The quarry is built near boulders to produce stone. These two buildings cover the basic supplies, planks, and stone that are used for building. In order for your settlers, the tiny humans you see all around your kingdom, to travel to buildings to either build, produce, and transport, a road system is mandatory. Though the road construction is quite restrictive and at times you are not able to connect a building to the main road despite having the ability to build the establishment in that location. Or when connecting the flag of the building to other roads, the game often only allows you to route in a long and inefficient path. Also to note that when the castle is built initially, there are borders that limit your building area, but this can be expanded with a military building such as a barracks and guardhouse for examples. I will be transparent, when I initially played the first Settlers, I had absolutely no clue how to play, and usually with a bit of trial and error you can figure out the gameplay and learn. Well, this was not the case here. The fact that there is no tutorial, which is not surprising for games in the 90s. Just the overall lack of labeling and brief explanation of the buildings and commands really had you lost at sea with no sense of direction. Reading the manual was recommended for games at this time, but who has the time for that, and are we here to play or go through a large body of text? This is partially why I would not classify this as an RTS, because of its super slow pace and very little focus on military. And speaking of military, the conflict between the player and the enemy is slow paced and not quite real time. Yes, you have the ability to select an enemy military building to attack, but once that command has been placed, you don't have any control of how your units attack. In other words, there is no strategy that can be utilized to provide you with an advantage, as you have no micromanager ability to outwit your opponent, such as formations by keeping weaker units covered, flanking, false retreating, and luring. The battles are analytical. The side with the more military and stronger units essentially will win. It is also funny watching the conflict, as each one of your units will match up to one of their units in a 1v1, and any extra units that are not matched up will stand there and wait for one of the victors to engage in a duel. The Settlers both 1 and 2 are heavily focused on economy, and it feels more of a relaxed game with an extremely slow pace. At times it was boring and stale for my enjoyment. Even though city builders tend to be more slow paced in general, the fact that this one in particular had very minimal consequences that we are used to seeing. Happiness meter of the population is not present to have you switch focus on an area the population demands to be addressed. You'll not have to worry about random disasters from the weather or population such as fires, as they do not occur. I understand the two Settlers games were made in the mid-90s and games were still at their early stages overall, but I do not know how much I can say this game has pitched for the RTS picture that some of you requested I cover. Maybe the fact that this is one of the earliest hybrid city builder and RTS combo. These two games are part of a series, and there are many others that have preceded it, and it seems to have garnered quite a following. Our next game on this hidden gem RTS timeline has flown under the radar to most gamers and even ones who tuned into the RTS since its beginnings. Z, published by Virgin Interactive and developed by the English Bitmap brothers, who were known in the late 80s and early 90s for their games that were ported for the Atari and the Amiga. Within Z, you play as the two red robot friends who are challenged by their boss, Zod, to wipe out the blue faction from the many different planets. The story is silly and has a lot of outdated 90s humor, which I guess is great for the nostalgia, but other than that, not worth delving into any deeper.
Oh shit!
Once again, this RTS is not of the usual breed we witnessed on the main timeline during this time, and again it has me question its legitimacy as an RTS. But again, we'll get into this more, and I'll let you decide on which genre it classifies under. One of its unusual gameplay aspects that we did cover on the main RTS timeline, but later in the more modern era, were the territorial control points equivalent to that of Company of Heroes. By capturing these territories, the player is given either recruitment buildings such as robot or vehicle factories, which automatically recruit units, and because there is no resource to collect, it is infinite so long as the territory that they are situated in is occupied by you, something we don't see in an RTS too often, and technically lacks one of the main principles we use to define an RTS, resource gathering. The other buildings that may be present on the control point can be a radar station, which gives you the location of the enemy units on the mini-map, or a repair facility that may repair your vehicles. So there are benefits to capturing territories aside from being obliged to because the victory condition requires it, which in turn provides the player with instant gratification, thus increasing the overall pace of the gameplay and causing the conflict between the two to initiate much earlier than a classic RTS. My thoughts, which I have shared with you about Company of Heroes, is the same idea for this game. I've repudiated this idea of fast gameplay in the past RTS, as I always thought it was necessary to have the option to tech up and prepare before launching an attack. I guess feelings towards certain perspective change, and teching up and turtling now seems to be more of a burden. Don't get any ideas, I still enjoy the slower paced games too. I can already imagine the angry comments awaiting. The pathfinding is not efficient when comparing games to its time. I'm not too fond of the initial route that is chosen and oftentimes have to click smaller waypoints to correct it. But what stands out the most is that the unit movement relative to the fast gameplay is very slow. At times, you can be left not doing anything but watching until your units reach the command point due to this, and also the fact that there are hardly any macro management present in the game. The original version was played on DOS, but a new version was quickly made for Windows called Z95, which fixed a slow frame rate issue, and it also added 15 more levels and a primitive map editor. Both versions had multiplayer through LAN and only 1v1. Oddly enough, the version on Steam does not have multiplayer present due to it being the mobile version. Other than a few setbacks, Z is a great real-time tactic. Yeah, I said it. That saves you from the grief of having some of the usual responsibilities of an RTS, and is easy to just pick up and play whenever you feel for whatever period of time that fits your liking. And for our last RTS that we will cover on the first part of this Hidden Gem RTS timeline, was developed and published by an important video game developer for the RTS picture as a whole, Westwood Studios, who holds the responsibility of the Command & Conquer series, and about a year earlier released the first installment which we saw on the classics of the main RTS timeline. The one that we will touch on is part of the Command & Conquer series, but in an alternate universe, subtitled Red Alert. In this timeline, Albert Einstein travels back in time to eliminate Adolf Hitler before his rise to power as an authoritarian, and to erase all the atrocities the Nazi Empire has caused in common history. While this idea would be the inclination of the majority of the population right after the Second World War, they were unaware that because of Hitler's complete removal from the timeline, this allowed Joseph Stalin and the Soviets to rise into power and now have spawned into an equivalent totalitarian regime. Same idea as Command & Conquer 1, Red Alert has two factions, the Allies and the Soviets, who each have contrasting gameplay styles. But the good guys and bad guys seem to have switched in gameplay style. The Allies have faster, cheaper, and weaker units, like the Brotherhood of the Nod, and the Soviets attack using slower, stronger, and more expensive units, similar to that of the GDI. One aspect that shines brightly about this game are the faction-unique units and their counters. An example that stood out and I found was very interesting were the Soviet attack dogs, who were used to counter infantry. When the dogs are ordered to attack infantry, they begin to sprint towards a target and can jump attack from a distance. They shred their targets into pieces for an instant kill and can jump towards other nearby enemy units at haste. While they have a lot of upsides, they also come with a mass amount of flaws, being they are immensely weak and can only take a few hits, and the other being that they may only attack infantry, so they are utterly useless against vehicles and buildings. But they are great to combine with strong armored vehicle attacks present with the Soviets. The field medics, who are only available for recruitment with the Allies, are not a counter but more of a support unit to keep infantry alive longer. Any injured friendly infantry surrounding the medic will be healed to full health. And as always, we do have to mention the flaws, and that being their expensive cost, the weak level of health, and the obvious one not being able to attack. The introduction to naval and airships in comparison to Command & Conquer 1 was admirable, and was Westwood's way of telling Warcraft fans, we have it as well, but better. The Soviet Air Force being stronger in comparison to the Allies because of the variety coming from the MiG, who is good at disabling armored units and buildings with its missiles, to the Yak aircraft, who is great for killing infantry, especially when they are grouped together. For the naval forces, the Allies have the upper hand on this one, also due to the variety and having a versatile ship called the Destroyer, who attacks land, air, and sea-based units and can detect the two submarine units that compose the Soviets' entire naval force. It is sometimes hard to believe that within only 1 year and using the same game engine as Command & Conquer 1, the gameplay has changed a lot through balance between the races, yet further distinguishing the two with little to no similar units. The introduction of naval and air force were significant to your overall tactics, and not just used against enemy units of the same category. The overall story sucked you in because it had you question, would this have happened if our own reality was altered this way too? The cinematics were recordings of actual actors in live action. Same as the previous Command & Conquer, it is unusual in comparison to CGI cinematics, which was the choice most devs opted to use, but is still enjoyable. And while I have classified this as a hidden gem, it was successful both financially selling more than 1.5 million copies in less than 4 weeks from launch, and critically winning Best Strategy Game, Game Choice Awards 1997. One can argue that it was even more successful than the first Command & Conquer we covered on the main timeline. Despite that, I still think it's a hidden gem in my opinion, as it does seem to have been passed on by many people around the time of its release, and I am a culprit for being one of those people.
Incompetence will not be tolerated.
The reason was likely because of its spin-off story, and you know how it is with spin-offs. Are they ever better than the main storyline? Well, Red Alert sure debunked that belief.
You have covered yourself in great honor.
These 4 games have pitched in their fair share for the RTS picture. While they may not have been on most gamers' radar at the time, it is still important to share their noteworthy RTS implications. And while I did not enjoy them enough at the time of their release, they still have entertainment value, especially if you're into the classic gaming that comes with simplicity, manual tasks, and of course the cheesy 90s humor.
Get out of here!
Did these classic RTS fly under your radar too? What is your hidden gem RTS? This series will continue along a chronological timeline, and to be quite honest, I do not know how long it will be, as there are a lot of RTS that deserve to be covered. And because this is an ongoing series, I may flip back and forth to other new genre timelines or continue the FPS one, which so far can definitely use some love with the first video, or even share your reasoning on how the video could have been better. Check it out if you're into FPS that pioneered one of the most popular video game genres. It is always appreciated when you CLS, and I do not mind the constructive criticism at all. This is how the channel will grow. Thanks for sticking around, and I hope you have a pleasant day.